At 1047 hours on May 7th, 1942, Lieutenant Edward O'Hare flew at 18,000 feet above the Coral Sea with his finger resting on the trigger of 6 Browning .50 caliber machine guns, watching a Japanese Zero position itself 1,200 yards ahead for an attack run on American dive bombers below. Every regulation, every training manual, every combat briefing said the same thing: don't fire until 400 yards. At 1,200 yards, .50 caliber ammunition was supposedly ineffective. Hit probability at this range with standard loads was 12%. Might as well throw rocks. O'Hare tracked the Zero anyway, leading the target, calculating deflection, feeling the Wildcats' controls respond two-way inputs. His finger tightened on the trigger. Every instinct screamed, wait, close the distance, follow doctrine. But something was different today. Something about the 1,800 rounds loaded in his aircraft made him willing to try what no pilot had successfully done before: kill a Zero at triple the effective engagement range. O'Hare fired. 6 Browning machine guns hammered simultaneously, 70 rounds per second erupting from his wings in a sustained burst that shook the Wildcat's airframe. Tracers arced through empty sky toward the Zero, bright phosphorus trails marking their path like fingers pointing at death. Normally, this is where doctrine proved correct. Tracers would appear to hit the target, sparking off metal, seemingly impacting perfectly. But the Zero would keep flying because the tracer rounds lighter. Different ballistic trajectory weren't the killing rounds. The heavier ball ammunition that actually destroyed aircraft flew a different path entirely, passing uselessly above or below the enemy fighter. Pilots watched their tracers hit while their targets escaped unharmed. Except this time was different. Explosions erupted exactly where O'Hare's tracers indicated. The Zero's left engine disintegrated in a shower of metal fragments and burning oil. The wing fuel tank ignited half a second later, orange fireball blooming at 1,200 yards like a miniature sun. The Zero rolled inverted, pilot probably dead or unconscious, and fell toward the ocean 4 miles below. O'Hare's wingman, Lieutenant Richard Loesch, broke radio silence immediately. "How the hell did you hit from there?" O'Hare didn't answer. Didn't know how to answer. Didn't understand what just happened except that his ammunition worked differently than it should. He tracked a second Zero at 1,100 yards, adjusting aim slightly, and fired again. Same result. Tracers indicated, destruction followed. Perfect correlation between where he aimed and what died. The second Zero exploded, trailing fire and debris. This wasn't normal. This wasn't possible. Something about his ammunition was fundamentally different from what every other pilot in the Pacific Fleet carried. The third Zero broke formation the moment its wingmen died, diving hard to escape. O'Hare followed, pushing his Wildcat's nose down, building speed. The range opened 1,300 yards, 1,350, 1,400. Beyond maximum effective range according to every gunnery manual published by the U.S. Navy. At this distance, standard ammunition dispersed so widely that hitting a fighter-sized target was pure luck. O'Hare fired anyway. A 3-second burst, 210 rounds. The Zero's tail section shattered like glass hit with a hammer. Debris tumbled earthward, the aircraft entering an uncontrolled spin from which no pilot could recover. 3 kills in 4 minutes. All at ranges where kills simply didn't happen. Then 4 more Zeros appeared, diving toward him from 11,000 feet in a coordinated head-on attack. Range: 1,000 yards and closing at 600 miles per hour combined speed. Standard doctrine for head-on passes was unambiguous. Break off. Don't take the shot. Closure rate too fast, hit probability too low, collision risk too high. Maneuver defensively and live to fight another approach. O'Hare held his course, Wildcat boring straight, toward 4 enemy fighters. He opened fire at 1,000 yards. The lead Zero's propeller exploded, 3 blades shattering simultaneously, the engine cowling ripped open by chunks of metal moving at supersonic speed. The Zero nosed over violently, pilot fighting controls that no longer responded. The other 3 Zeros scattered, their coordinated attack disintegrating into individual survival maneuvers. 4 kills in 6 minutes. All at ranges exceeding 1,000 yards. Ranges where physics said ammunition couldn't be accurate enough. Where combat experience said targets were too small and moving too fast. Where doctrine said, don't even try. But O'Hare had just destroyed 4 Japanese aircraft at distances that should have been impossible, and he had no idea why. He returned to USS Lexington at 1,143 hours, fuel low, ammunition expended 1,400 of 1,800 rounds fired. The landing was routine. Catch the wire, throttle back, roll to a stop. He shut down the engine, suddenly aware that his hands were shaking, not from fear, from realization. Whatever ammunition had been loaded in his aircraft today was different, fundamentally, impossibly different. He climbed out of the cockpit into organized chaos. Deck crews swarming, fuel hoses being dragged into position, ordnance carts wheeling toward other aircraft. Everyone had seen the combat. Radar had tracked the engagement. Radio operators had heard the running commentary. 4 confirmed kills at ranges no one believed possible. Pilots and deck crew alike were congratulating him, shouting questions, demanding to know how he'd done it. O'Hare ignored them all. He walked past the celebration, past the backslaps and amazed faces, looking for one specific man. He found Aviation Ordnanceman 2nd Class Raymond Hutchins standing near the armory entrance, half hidden behind a fuel bowser, watching. Hutchins was 28 years old, Indianapolis, 6 years in the Navy, quiet and methodical. He'd loaded O'Hare's ammunition the previous night. This moment, O'Hare walking toward him was the answer to a question Hutchins had been asking for 4 hours. Did it work? O'Hare stopped directly in front of him. The deck noise faded to background. For 3 seconds, neither man spoke. Then O'Hare said 2 words. It worked. Hutchins exhaled for what felt like the first time since dawn. The illegal modification worked. The unauthorized ammunition performed exactly as physics predicted it would. Matched weight rounds flying identical trajectories, tracers indicating precisely where killing rounds impacted. It worked, but now they faced a different problem. What happens next? Tell the squadron commander? Risk court-martial for both of them? Or keep it quiet and let other pilots continue dying with standard ammunition that failed at combat ranges? The screen cut to black. White text appeared. 6 days earlier. The story rewound to its beginning, to how one ordnanceman's illegal modification changed ammunition design forever, to how breaking regulations saved 1,000 pilots' lives, to how it all started with 1 death too many. Between April and June 1942, Fighting Squadron 3, aboard USS Lexington, operated under a simple reality that was killing American pilots at a rate of 1.2 per week. Every F4F Wildcat carried the same ammunition load, designated by Naval Ordnance as Standard Mix A, a pattern of 4 ball rounds followed by 1 tracer round, repeating through 1,800 rounds across 6 guns. The specification came from the Bureau of Ordnance in Washington, tested and validated for combat conditions observed in the European theatre, where Luftwaffe fighters engaged at 300 to 400 yards in close-range turning dogfights. At those distances, Standard Mix A worked perfectly. Ball rounds solid core, armor-piercing, 647 grains each punched through aircraft skin and destroyed critical components. Tracer rounds phosphorus compound core, 618 grains each burned bright enough for pilots to see their point of impact and adjust aim in real time. The 29-grain weight difference between ball and tracer created approximately 3 inches of vertical separation at 400 yards, negligible, within acceptable margin of error for a target the size of a Messerschmitt or Focke-Wulf. Standard Mix A had proven itself over France, over Britain, over the Channel, but Pacific combat was different in ways no one in Washington had anticipated. The Japanese Mitsubishi, a 6M0, was faster than a Wildcat in a climb, turned tighter in any maneuver, and was flown by pilots who'd been in combat since 1937. Japanese aviators learned within the first month of war that close-range dogfights with American fighters meant trading the Zero's maneuverability advantage for the Wildcat's superior firepower and armor. The tactical adaptation was immediate and effective. Engage American fighters from 800 to 1,000 yards. Fire disciplined bursts from long range, then break away before Americans could close. Distance. The Zero's two 20mm cannons and two 7.7mm machine guns were accurate enough at extended range to damage Wildcats, while American return fire at those distances seemed completely ineffective. Zeros would initiate attacks from positions where American pilots couldn't force knife-fighting range without entering prolonged turning engagements, which meant death against an aircraft that could complete a 360-degree turn in 14 seconds. So combat happened at 800 yards. And at 800 yards, Standard Mix A stopped working. The physics were brutal and unforgiving. That 29-grain difference between tracer and ball rounds became catastrophic at extended range. Tracer rounds, lighter by 4.5%, experienced different deceleration through air resistance. They flew a lower, flatter trajectory. Ball rounds, heavier and denser, decelerated differently, arcing higher. At 800 yards, the vertical separation between tracer impact and ball impact measured 15 to 30 inches depending on angle and airspeed. A Zero fighter was 29 feet long and 12 feet wide. A 30-inch vertical miss meant complete miss. But pilots couldn't see ball rounds in flight. They aimed using tracers, the only ammunition visible to the human eye during combat. When a pilot saw his tracers walking up an enemy's fuselage, he believed he was hitting. His training said tracers indicated point of impact for all rounds. So he held the trigger down, watching tracers spark off metal, confident he was destroying the target. Except he wasn't. He was hitting with 20% of his ammunition the tracers. The other 80%, the ball rounds that actually destroyed aircraft, flew a different path entirely, passing uselessly above or below the enemy. The result was pilots reporting the same frustration in every debrief. I saw hits, but nothing happened. They weren't crazy. They were hitting with tracers only. The human cost accumulated with mathematical precision. VF3 lost 23 Wildcats in long-range engagements between April and June 1942. 23 pilots dead. The pattern was identical in every case. Pilot engages Zero at 800+ yards because closing distance means entering a turning fight where the Zero's maneuverability is decisive. Pilot fires, sees tracers impacting, believes he's scoring hits. Zero continues fighting, apparently undamaged, and reverses to get on the American's tail. American pilot dies. After-action reports consistently mentioned ammunition ineffective at extended range, or observed hits with no apparent damage. Flight surgeons noted increased stress among pilots who reported hitting targets that wouldn't go down, leading some to question their own gunnery skills. Training officers scheduled additional range time. Pilots requested more practice. But practice wasn't the problem. Equipment was the problem. The statistics told a story no one was reading. VF3 combat engagements from April through May showed clear correlation between range and effectiveness. At 300 to 400 yards, 67% hit rate, 12 confirmed kills, 2 aircraft lost. At 600 to 800 yards, 18% hit rate, 3 confirmed kills, 7 aircraft lost. At 800+ yards, 11% hit rate, 0 confirmed kills, 14 aircraft lost. The longer the range, the worse the performance. But ammunition specifications said Standard Mix A was accurate to 1,000 yards. The testing data from stateside ranges confirmed it. Guns fired at stationary targets showed acceptable dispersion patterns out to 1,200 yards. So, if the ammunition worked and the guns worked, the problem had to be pilot error. That's what the official reports concluded. Pilots needed better training, better discipline, better gunnery fundamentals. Meanwhile, pilots kept dying at a rate of 1.2 per week. 23 dead in 8 weeks. The 24th would be Lieutenant Thomas Ashford, and his death would be the one that finally pushed Aviation Ordnanceman Second Class Raymond Hutchins past the point of following regulations. Aviation Ordnanceman Second Class Raymond Hutchins was 28 years old, from Indianapolis, and had spent 6 years learning how ammunition worked before he understood why it was killing American pilots. He'd enlisted in 1936, straight out of technical school, and spent his first 3 years at Frankford Arsenal in Philadelphia, loading artillery shells and small arms ammunition for the Atlantic Fleet. Frankford was where the Navy manufactured most of its ordnance, where specifications were written and tolerances were tested, where Hutchins learned ballistics the way pilots learned aerodynamics through repetition, observation, and mathematics that didn't lie. He understood trajectory physics, powder charges, bullet weights, and manufacturing variances. He could calculate bullet drop at any range using nothing but a slide rule and ballistic coefficient tables. When he transferred to USS Lexington in January 1942 and was assigned to VF-3's armory, he brought knowledge that most ordnancemen didn't have. He didn't just load ammunition. He understood what happened to it after it left the barrel. His workspace was a cramped room below deck, 10 feet by 12 feet, lined with metal shelves holding ammunition belts, cleaning supplies, and tools. The smell was constant: gun, oil, metal, cordite, and the distinctive chemical tang of phosphorus from tracer compounds. Hutchins worked night shifts, 2,000 hours until 0800 hours, loading 1,800 rounds per aircraft across VF-3's 16 Wildcats. That meant 28,800 rounds every night, each one hand-loaded into fabric belts according to standard Mix A specifications. Ball, tracer, repeating. The work was mechanical, monotonous, and precise. A single round loaded backwards could jam a gun during combat. A single defective round could kill the pilot depending on it. So Hutchins was methodical about everything, checking each round visually before loading it, feeling for weight inconsistencies, looking for manufacturing defects. Other ordnancemen thought he was obsessive. Hutchins thought he was responsible. He loaded ammunition for men who flew into combat the next morning. If they died because of defective ammunition he'd loaded, that death was on him. But Hutchins did something most ordnancemen didn't do. He kept a notebook, a standard Navy-issue logbook where he recorded every combat mission, every pilot debrief he overheard, every complaint about ammunition performance. He tracked patterns. April 15th, 1942. Lieutenant Morrison reports saw tracer impacts, target undamaged, during engagement at 750 yards. April 18th. Lieutenant Chen reports same complaint. 800-yard engagement. April 22nd. Lieutenant Daniels, 850 yards. Same result. April 29th. Lieutenant Foster killed, long-range engagement. By early May, Hutchins had recorded 14 separate instances of pilots reporting tracer hits with no apparent damage, all at ranges exceeding 600 yards. The pattern was obvious to anyone looking for it. Nobody else was looking. Hutchins started asking questions during post-flight inspections, approaching pilots when they climbed out of cockpits, catching them before debriefs when details were still fresh. What range were you firing? Did you see your tracers hit? Where did they impact? What happened to the target? The answers were consistent. Long range, saw tracers hitting, target kept flying. Hutchins went back to his armory and pulled the specifications for standard Mix A, ball rounds. 647 grains nominal weight, tracer rounds. 618 grains nominal weight, 29 grain difference. He spent an entire night doing calculations he'd learned at Frankfurt Arsenal. Ballistic coefficient for M2 ball ammunition versus M1 tracer. Velocity degradation over distance. Trajectory drop at 400 yards, 600 yards, 800 yards. The mathematics were unforgiving. At 800 yards, That 29 grain weight difference created 15 inches of vertical separation between tracer impact and ball impact. Tracer rounds flew lower because they were lighter and decelerated differently. Ball rounds flew higher. A pilot aiming with tracers would see his visible rounds hitting perfectly while his invisible killing rounds sailed over the target. Hutchins took his findings to Chief Aviation Ordnanceman Robert Mitchell on May 1st. Showed him the calculations, the pilot reports, the pattern. Mitchell looked at the numbers for maybe 30 seconds before handing them back. Ammunition is within Bureau of Ordnance specifications, Mitchell said. 29 grain variance is within acceptable manufacturing tolerance. If pilots can't hit targets, they need better training. Chief, the ammunition works fine at 300 yards. At 800 yards, then pilots should engage at 300 yards like doctrine says. They can't close to 300 yards against zeros. Zero turns tighter, gets on their tail, kills them. Mitchell's face hardened. Are you telling me how to run this armory, Hutchins? No, Chief. I'm telling you the ammunition doesn't work at combat ranges. The ammunition is within specifications. That means it works. Dismissed. Hutchins walked back to his station knowing the conversation was over. Mitchell wasn't going to report the problem up the chain. Command wasn't going to hear about trajectory separation or ballistic coefficients, and pilots were going to keep dying. The next day, May 2nd, Lieutenant Thomas Ashford came looking for him. Ashford was 22 years old, from Kentucky, 9 combat missions, 2 confirmed kills, a good pilot who followed procedures and trusted his equipment. He found Hutchins in the armory at 1,130 hours, still wearing his flight suit, hands shaking slightly. Ray, I need to understand something. Hutchins looked up from the ammunition belt he was loading. Sir? I had a 0 dead in my sights this morning. Perfect deflection shot, 700 yards. I watched my tracers walk right up his fuselage from tail to cockpit, right up the center line. I fired 400 rounds. What happened? Nothing. He kept flying, turned on me, got on my tail. My wingman had to save me. Ashford's voice was steady but confused. I know I was hitting. I saw it. Hutchins set down the ammunition belt, explained the weight difference, the trajectory separation, the physics. Showed Ashford the calculations. Ashford stared at the numbers like they were written in a foreign language. You're saying the ammunition doesn't work? It works perfectly at 300 yards, sir. At 700 yards, physics takes over. Does command know about this? I reported it to Chief Mitchell. He said ammunition is within specifications. So, what do we do? I'm working on it, sir. Ashford nodded and left. He flew again that afternoon. At 1,430 hours on May 2nd, 1,942, emergency klaxons wailed across USS Lexington as radar detected 18 Japanese aircraft inbound from the northwest at 14,000 feet. VF-3 scrambled 8 Wildcats, including Lieutenant Thomas Ashford's aircraft number 23, loaded that morning by Raymond Hutchins with standard ammunition that Ashford now knew was fundamentally flawed at combat ranges. Hutchins stood on the flight deck watching Ashford taxi into position. Watching him advance throttle and accelerate down the wooden deck. Watching the Wildcat lift off and climb toward an enemy that would engage him at ranges where his ammunition betrayed him. Hutchins had loaded 1,800 rounds into that aircraft. 80% of those rounds would miss at the ranges where Ashford would be forced to fight. The mathematics didn't care about courage or skill. Physics didn't negotiate. Ashford was flying into combat with equipment that wouldn't work, and both men knew it. The engagement began at 1,507 hours, 22 miles northwest of Lexington. VF-3's 8 Wildcats intercepted 18 Japanese aircraft 6 Zeros, and 12 Aichi dive bombers heading for the carrier. Standard American tactical doctrine said, engage the fighters first, clear them from the bombers, then attack the strike package. But the Zeros didn't cooperate with American doctrine. They climbed immediately when they spotted the Wildcats. using their superior rate of climb to gain altitude advantage while staying 1,000 yards ahead of the pursuing Americans. The Wildcats couldn't catch them. The Zeros established position at 16,000 feet and waited, perfectly positioned to dive on any Wildcat that committed to attacking the bombers below. It was a tactical trap. Attack the bombers and the Zeros dive on you from above. Chase the Zeros and the bombers reach Lexington unopposed. Ashford's flight leader, Lieutenant Commander Paul Ramsey, made the only decision that made sense. Split the formation. 4 Wildcats engage Zeros, 4 attack bombers. Ashford's division drew zero duty. The 4 Zeros dove. At 1,509 hours, 6 aircraft in 2 3-plane elements attacking from different angles to divide American defensive fire. Ashford picked the lead Zero in the right-hand element, a classic approach from 4 o'clock high, 1,200 yards, and closing. He should have waited. Should have let the Zero close to 400 yards where standard Mix A worked. But waiting meant the Zero chose the engagement range, controlled the geometry, decided when to break off. Waiting meant fighting on the enemy's terms. Ashford had talked with Hutchins 3 hours ago, understood that his ammunition wouldn't work at long range, but he also understood that letting a Zero dictate terms meant death. So at 850 yards he opened fire. 6 Brownings hammering, 70 rounds per second, tracers arcing toward the diving Zero. Ashford saw impacts. Saw tracers sparking off the Zero's engine cowling, walking up toward the cockpit. Perfect deflection, perfect lead. He was hitting. The Zero kept coming. Didn't break off, didn't smoke, didn't show any damage. Ashford held the trigger down, burning through 300 rounds, watching tracer impacts the entire time. The Zero closed to 600 yards, then 400. At 350 yards, the Zero opened fire with its 2 20mm cannons. Ashford broke hard left, pushed his Wildcat into a 6G turn that grayed his vision at the edges. The Zero didn't follow the turn, didn't need to. It rolled inverted and dove away, using gravity and superior acceleration to exit the engagement before Ashford could recover and counterattack. Textbook Zero tactic: engage at long range, force American to maneuver defensively, disengage before American can respond. It worked because American ammunition didn't work at the ranges where Zeros fought. Ashford's wingman, Ensign Robert Chen, radioed, "Lead, you're smoking." Ashford checked his instruments. Oil pressure dropping on the Pratt & Whitney R1000. 830 engine, temperature rising. One of the Zero's 20mm rounds had clipped his oil cooler. Not catastrophic damage, but serious enough. He had maybe 20 minutes before the engine seized. Ramsey ordered him back to Lexington immediately. Ashford acknowledged, rolled wings level, and started descending toward the carrier 30 miles southeast. He never made it. 2 Zeros that had disengaged from the initial furball spotted the lone Wildcat trailing thin white smoke, obviously damaged, obviously vulnerable. They attacked from his blind spot, 6 o'clock low, where Ashford couldn't see them until they opened fire at 400 yards. By then it was too late. The first burst of 20mm fire hit Ashford's Wildcat in the engine compartment. The second burst walked up the fuselage into the cockpit. The third burst was unnecessary. The Wildcat nosed over at 8,000 feet and fell inverted, trailing black smoke and burning oil. It hit the ocean at approximately 1,519 hours. No parachute observed. No emergency radio transmission. No survivors. Hutchins learned about Ashford's death at 1,620 hours, when the remaining VF-3 aircraft returned to Lexington. He was on deck refueling Wildcat No. 7 when he saw only 7 aircraft in the landing pattern instead of 8. He knew before anyone told him. Knew from the count, from the way pilots climbed out of their cockpits without the usual post-mission energy, from the silence on the deck. Someone said Ashford's name, and Hutchins stopped hearing anything else. The fuel hose fell from his hands. Another ordnanceman caught it before it sprayed across the deck. Hutchins walked to the island superstructure, found a quiet space behind a ventilator shaft, and stood there for 10 minutes, doing nothing except breathing and thinking. Ashford was the 9th pilot Hutchins had loaded ammunition for who was now dead. 9 men in 6 weeks. 9 pilots who climbed into aircraft trusting that their equipment worked, trusting that their ordnancemen had given them everything they needed to survive, trusting that the Navy wouldn't send them into combat with ammunition that failed at combat ranges. That trust had killed them. Or more precisely, Hutchins thought, following regulations had killed them. Standard Mix A was approved doctrine, tested and validated within Bureau of Ordnance specifications. It was also killing pilots at 1.2 per week, and nobody seemed willing to acknowledge that specifications written for European combat didn't work in the Pacific. Hutchins went back to his armory at 2,000 hours and sat at his loading bench, staring at shelves of ammunition belts he'd loaded according to regulations. He thought about Ashford saying, "I know I was hitting 3 hours before he died." Thought about trajectory separation and ballistic coefficients, and 29 grains of weight difference that translated to 15 inches of miss at 800 yards. Thought about Chief Mitchell saying ammunition was within specifications. Thought about 43 more pilots dying while approval wound through bureaucracy for 9 months. Then he pulled out his precision scale, the one he'd borrowed from the machine shop without asking permission, and started weighing tracer rounds one at a time. It was 0230 hours on May 3rd, 1942. Raymond Hutchins was about to break every regulation in the Naval Ordnance Manual. And he was about to save 1,000 lives. Hutchins worked alone in the armory for the next 4 hours, while Lexington sailed through darkness and everyone else aboard slept. The overhead lights hummed. The ventilation system circulated stale air that smelled like metal and cosmoline. His hands moved with mechanical precision, placing tracer rounds one at a time onto the scale borrowed from the machine shop, reading the measurement, recording it in his notebook, sorting rounds into piles. The scale was accurate to 1/10 of a grain, far more precise than anything officially issued to ordnancemen, and completely unauthorized for Hutchins to possess. He didn't care. The scale told truth. Naval regulations had gotten 9 pilots killed. He'd trust the scale. Standard tracer round specifications called for 618 grains nominal weight with a manufacturing tolerance of plus or minus 5 grains. That meant any tracer between 613 and 623 grains met Navy acceptance standards and could be loaded into combat ammunition. Hutchins weighed 2,000 tracer rounds from VF-3's inventory that night. The actual weights ranged from 615 to 622 grains, a 7-grain variance across the sample. Most clustered around 618, but the distribution was wide enough to matter. He separated them into 8 piles by exact weight: 615, 616, 617, 618, 619, 620, 621, 622 grains. The largest pile was 618 grains, about 900 rounds. That became his baseline. Now he needed ball ammunition at the same weight. The problem was obvious immediately. Ball rounds were specified at 647 grains, 29 grains heavier than tracers. You couldn't make ball ammunition lighter without changing its fundamental design, removing the lead core or replacing it with something less dense. Hutchins couldn't manufacture ammunition. He could only work with what inventory provided. For 30 minutes he sat staring at the sorted piles of tracer rounds, thinking he'd wasted 4 hours on an impossible problem. Then he remembered the armor-piercing incendiary rounds stored in the secondary magazine. API rounds used a tungsten carbide penetrator, surrounded by incendiary compound instead of solid lead core. Different composition meant different weight. Hutchins had never paid attention to API specifications because they weren't part of Standard Mix A, but now he pulled the technical manual and checked. API rounds, 622 grains nominal, plus or minus 4 grains tolerance. He went to the secondary magazine, unlocked it with his master key, and pulled out 50 API rounds. Started weighing. The first round, 620 grains, second, 621, third, 618, fourth, 619. Hutchins kept weighing, kept sorting, hands moving faster now because he'd found the answer. After 2 hours, he'd weighed 3,000 API rounds from inventory and separated out 340 rounds at exactly 618 grains. 340 rounds wasn't enough for a full combat load that required 1,800 rounds. But it was enough for half a load if he alternated API with tracer. 900 tracer at 618 grains, 900 API at 618 grains, alternating in the belt. Tracer API, tracer API. Every round weighing exactly the same. Every round flying exactly the same trajectory. Where the visible tracer went, the invisible API followed. Perfect correlation between point of aim and point of impact. The theoretical advantage was enormous. Standard Mix A gave pilots a 20% tracer ratio, 1 tracer for every 4 ball rounds. Hutchins' modification gave 50% every other round visible. A pilot would see constant feedback, constant confirmation of where his rounds were going, and because the weights matched perfectly, that feedback would be accurate. No more 15-inch separation at 800 yards. No more hitting with tracers while ball rounds missed. If the tracer hit, the API hit. Simple physics, but implementing it violated at least 6 naval regulations. Modifying authorized ammunition loads without approval. Court-martial offense. Using non-standard mixing ratios. Court-martial offense. Hand-selecting ammunition by weight instead of loading from inventory as issued, unauthorized procedure. Installing API rounds in aircraft not configured for them. Violation of aircraft armament specifications. Hutchins counted the violations in his head and decided he didn't care. 9 pilots dead in 6 weeks. Regulations weren't saving lives. He started loading the belt at 0430 hours. 1 aircraft, 1,800 rounds, 6 guns, 300 rounds per gun. The work required absolute concentration because one mistake ruined the entire belt. Tracer API, tracer API, tracer API, linking each round into the fabric belt, checking twice that he hadn't accidentally doubled up or reversed the pattern. His fingers started bleeding around round 900 from the sharp edges of belt links cutting into skin already raw from handling ammunition for 6 hours straight. He wrapped them in electrical tape and kept working. At 0547 hours, he loaded the final round number 1,800 and sat back against the bulkhead, exhausted. The morning shift would arrive at 0600. 13 minutes to clean up, hide the evidence. Make it look like he'd loaded standard ammunition instead of creating something that had never existed before. Hutchins placed the modified belt into the standard ammunition locker, labeled it 300 AC O'Hare in his normal handwriting. Aircraft 300, assigned to Lieutenant O'Hare. Nobody would question it. Nobody inspected ammunition that closely. They trusted ordnancemen to follow procedures, trusted that every belt met specifications. That trust was what allowed Hutchins to violate regulations without immediate discovery. But it also meant if the modification failed, if O'Hare's guns jammed, or if the trajectory calculations were wrong, or if some factor Hutchins hadn't considered caused the ammunition to perform worse than standard loads, the failure would be catastrophic. O'Hare could die, and Hutchins would face charges for loading defective ammunition that killed a Medal of Honor recipient. The morning shift arrived at 0603 hours. Chief Mitchell walked past the armory at 0615, glanced in, saw Hutchins organizing tools. "You're here early, Hutchins?" "Couldn't sleep, Chief. Figured I'd get a head start on today's loads." Mitchell nodded and kept walking. Hutchins exhaled slowly. The modified ammunition was loaded, labeled, and sitting in inventory, waiting for installation. Now he needed to find O'Hare and convince him to test it. Convince him to knowingly load unauthorized ammunition that could get them both court-martialed. Convince a Medal of Honor recipient to trust an ordnanceman's calculations over naval regulations. Hutchins thought about Ashford dying yesterday. Thought about 8 others before him. thought about the next pilot who'd die at long range because standard ammunition didn't work. He went looking for O'Hare at 1,400 hours. Lieutenant Edward O'Hare sat in VF-3's ready room at 1,400 hours, studying intelligence reports about Japanese carrier movements, when Aviation Ordnanceman Hutchins appeared in the doorway. O'Hare had been reviewing estimates of enemy strength for tomorrow's expected engagement somewhere between 60 and 90 Japanese aircraft, according to radio intercepts and reconnaissance photos. Big numbers. The kind of numbers that got pilots killed if their equipment didn't work perfectly. He looked up when Hutchins knocked on the doorframe, recognizing him immediately. Hutchins had loaded his ammunition for 3 months, kept his guns functioning flawlessly, never complained, and never cut corners. Good ordnanceman, the kind you trusted. Something wrong, Hutchins? O'Hare asked. Hutchins stepped inside, closed. The door behind him stood at attention. Sir, I need to talk to you about ammunition. O'Hare set down the intelligence folder. What about it? Standard Mix A doesn't work at long range. The tracer and ball rounds fly different trajectories because they weigh different amounts. At 800 yards, they separate by 15 inches vertically. Hutchins spoke quickly, like he'd rehearsed this. Pilots aim using tracers because that's the only ammunition they can see, but tracers are lighter, so they fly lower. The ball rounds, the ones that actually kill aircraft, fly higher. Pilots think they're hitting because they see tracer impacts, but 80% of their ammunition is missing. O'Hare leaned back in his chair, processing. He'd experienced exactly what Hutchins described a dozen times. Saw tracers hitting, target kept flying. Assumed he was missing with some rounds due to dispersion or his own gunnery errors. Never considered the ammunition itself was designed wrong. You're saying every pilot in the fleet has this problem? Yes, sir. But it only shows up at extended range. At 300 yards, the separation is negligible. At 800 yards, it's catastrophic. Does command know? I reported it to Chief Mitchell. He said ammunition is within specifications. Hutchins pulled a notebook from his pocket, opened it to a page covered with calculations. The math doesn't lie, sir. 29 grain weight difference creates these trajectories. He showed O'Hare the ballistics, the trajectory curves, the separation distances. O'Hare studied the numbers. He'd taken gunnery mathematics at Pensacola, understood ballistic coefficients and bullet drop. Hutchins' calculations looked correct. More than correct, they explained every frustrating long-range engagement O'Hare had experienced since January. What's the solution? O'Hare asked. Match the weights, Hutchins said. I've hand-selected ammunition where tracers and armor-piercing incendiary rounds both weigh exactly 618 grains. They'll fly identical trajectories. And I've changed the mixing ratio from 4 to 1 to 1 to 1 alternating. 50% tracers instead of 20%. You'll see exactly where every round goes. O'Hare understood immediately what Hutchins wasn't saying. That's not authorized, is it? No, sir. If you load unauthorized ammunition and someone finds out, what happens to you? Court-martial. Dishonorable discharge. Military prison, probably. What happens to me? Same, sir. Officer knowingly using unauthorized ammunition violates regulations just as much as ordnanceman loading it. Silence filled the ready room. Outside, flight deck crew shouted instructions for aircraft positioning. A Wildcat's engine coughed to life, then settled into steady rumble, the sounds of a carrier preparing for combat that would happen at ranges where Standard Mix A failed. O'Hare thought about February 20th when he'd defended Lexington alone against 9 Japanese bombers, thought about watching his tracers hit bombers that kept flying until he'd closed to 300 yards and finally destroyed them. Thought about how many he could have killed at longer range if his ammunition had worked correctly. Thought about Lieutenant Ashford dying yesterday. What's the performance difference? O'Hare asked. At 800 yards, you'll hit what you're aiming at. Every round. Physics guarantees it if the weights match. You're certain? I've done the mathematics 3 times, sir. Checked it against Frankfurt Arsenal ballistic tables. The trajectories will be identical. O'Hare stood, walked to the window overlooking the flight deck. His Wildcat was spotted forward, already fueled, waiting for tomorrow's mission. Somewhere out there, 60 to 90 Japanese aircraft were preparing to attack Lexington. He'd be flying straight into them with 6 guns that were supposed to protect not just himself but the carrier and its 2,800 crew. If Hutchins was right, standard ammunition would fail at the ranges where combat actually happened. If Hutchins was wrong, O'Hare would be testing defective ammunition in combat and probably dying because of it. But O'Hare trusted 2 things absolutely: mathematics and men who did their jobs well. Hutchins had done his job perfectly for 3 months. The mathematics looked sound. "When can you have it ready?" O'Hare asked, still looking out the window. "It's ready now, sir." "Your aircraft." "I loaded it last night." O'Hare turned around sharply. "You loaded unauthorized ammunition on my aircraft without asking permission first?" Hutchins stood rigid, face expressionless. "Yes, sir. I apologize, but pilots are dying, and I couldn't wait." For 5 seconds O'Hare stared at him, expression unreadable. Then something that might have been a smile touched the corner of his mouth. "You put your career on the line before knowing if I'd agree to test it." "Yes, sir." "Why?" "Because 9 pilots are dead and waiting for approval means 43 more die before authorization comes through." "I did the math on that too, sir." O'Hare sat back down, gestured for Hutchins to sit as well. Hutchins remained standing. "If I test this tomorrow and it works, what happens next?" O'Hare asked. "I make more. Load other aircraft. As many as I can before someone stops me." "Without authorization?" "Yes, sir. And if it doesn't work, we never speak of it again. I remove the modified ammunition, go back to standard loads, and accept whatever punishment comes." "What if I get killed testing it? Then I face court-martial for loading defective ammunition that killed a Medal of Honor recipient and the best pilot in VF3. O'Hare picked up the intelligence folder, looked at the estimated enemy strength numbers again. 60 to 90 aircraft. Most of them would engage at 800 yards or more. Standard ammunition failed at 800 yards. The choice wasn't really a choice at all. "I've got patrol tomorrow at dawn," O'Hare said. "If Japanese come like intelligence thinks they will, I'll test your ammunition." "Thank you, sir." "Don't thank me yet. If this works, we're both breaking regulations. If it doesn't work, we're breaking regulations for nothing. Either way, we're risking court-martial." "Yes, sir. But if it works, pilots stop dying at long range because their ammunition betrays them." O'Hare stood, extended his hand. Hutchins shook it. "One condition," O'Hare said. "If this ammunition performs like you say it does, you tell me immediately. I'll take it to Commander Ramsey myself. Get it approved up the chain." "And if they refuse approval, sir?" "Then we load it anyway and deal with consequences later. I'm not watching more pilots die because Washington can't do mathematics." They stood there, officer and enlisted man, both understanding they'd just agreed to violate regulations that could end their careers. But they also understood that 9 pilots were dead and standard ammunition was killing Americans faster than Japanese were. The agreement was made. Illegal, unauthorized, and completely necessary. May 7th would prove whether physics beat doctrine. Whether one ordnanceman's calculations could save lives, regulations couldn't protect. Between 0200 and 0600 hours on May 7th, 1942, Raymond Hutchins didn't sleep. He sat in the armory with the lights off, listening to Lexington's hull creak as the carrier cut through Pacific swells, thinking about every calculation he'd made and every assumption he'd tested. The modified ammunition was loaded in O'Hare's aircraft. The weights matched 618 grains exactly, tracer and API, verified 3 times on the precision scale. The ballistics were sound, trajectory equations didn't lie, but combat wasn't mathematics. Combat was chaos and violence and 1,000 variables Hutchins couldn't control from an armory below deck. If he'd missed something, if some factor he hadn't considered made the modification fail, O'Hare would discover it at 18,000 feet with Japanese fighters trying to kill him. And Hutchins would be responsible. At 0615 hours, the flight deck came alive with engine starts and shouted commands. VF-3 was launching 16 Wildcats for combat air patrol. Hutchins went topside, stood near the island superstructure where he could see the flight line. O'Hare's Wildcat number 300 was spotted third in the launch sequence. O'Hare walked past 40 feet away, already wearing his flight gear, heading for his aircraft. He glanced toward Hutchins. Their eyes met for maybe 2 seconds. Neither man nodded or spoke. Then O'Hare climbed into his cockpit, and plane captains were pulling chocks, and the Wildcat was taxiing forward. The launch took 8 minutes. 16 Wildcats catapulted into grey dawn sky, formed up, and climbed northwest toward their patrol station. Hutchins watched until they disappeared into clouds at 6,000 feet. Then he went back below deck to wait. The wait lasted 4 hours and 32 minutes. At 0920 hours, radar detected contacts bearing 310 degrees, distance 45 miles. 18 bogies inbound. The call went out across the ship. Air raid warning. Air raid warning. All hands to battle stations. Hutchins was already at his battle station, the armory where his job was to prepare ammunition for any aircraft that returned damaged and needed rearming. But there was nothing to do except wait and listen to fragmented radio transmissions crackling through the overhead speakers. Fighter direction officers vectoring VF-3 toward the contacts. Pilots calling out positions and altitudes. Someone identifying the bogies as zeros and dive bombers. Then the radio traffic got fast and clipped as combat started. Tally 6 zeros, climbing. 12 dive bombers, heading for Lexington. Engaging bombers. The transmissions blurred together, voices overlapping, impossible to track individual aircraft. Hutchins heard O'Hare's voice once. Lead bomber, 1,200 yards. Then, silence for 30 seconds that felt like 30 minutes. Then O'Hare again. Splash 1. 30 seconds later. Splash 2. Someone else's voice. How the hell is he hitting from there? More transmissions, more overlapping calls. Hutchins couldn't track what was happening, couldn't tell if the modified ammunition was working or if O'Hare was just lucky. At 1,143 hours, the first Wildcats appeared in the landing pattern. Hutchins counted them as they came aboard. 9, 10, 11 aircraft, 5 still airborne or not returning. The deck erupted into organized chaos: fuel hoses, ammunition carts, maintenance crews swarming each aircraft as it taxied clear of the landing area. Hutchins stayed near the island, watching. O'Hare's Wildcat landed 7th. Caught the 3-wire, rolled to a stop, engine shutting down. The canopy opened and O'Hare climbed out, pulled off his flight helmet, said something to his plane captain. Then he started walking across the deck, not toward the ready room for debriefing, but toward the island where Hutchins stood half hidden behind a ventilator. Other pilots and deck crew were congratulating O'Hare as he passed, shouting questions, but he ignored them. Walked straight to Hutchins and stopped 3 feet away. For maybe 5 seconds, neither man spoke. Flight deck noise engines, shouts, metal clanging faded into background. Then O'Hare said 2 words. It worked. Hutchins felt something release in his chest that he hadn't realized was locked tight for 4 hours. You're certain? 4 kills. All over 1,000 yards. Ranges where kills don't happen. O'Hare's voice was level, but his eyes were bright with something between excitement and disbelief. I watched my tracers indicate and watched explosions happen exactly where the tracers hit. Perfect correlation. Every round went exactly where I aimed it. Any malfunctions? Any problems? None. Guns ran smooth. Ammunition fed perfectly. It's not just that it worked, it's that it's worked better than anything I've flown with. O'Hare glanced around, lowered his voice. I need you to load every aircraft in the squadron, tonight. However many you can do. Sir, I know what it is. I'm taking this to Commander Ramsey in 10 minutes at debriefing. I'll tell him the ammunition worked. I'll tell him we need it on every aircraft. But even if he authorizes it, even if this goes up the chain, bureaucracy takes time. Meanwhile, we've got combat tomorrow and the day after. I need you loading modified ammunition tonight, regardless of what Ramsey says. If he orders me to stop, then we'll deal with that. But I'm betting he won't once he sees the combat footage and hears the results. A lieutenant from another division walked past, shouted at O'Hare, 4 kills? At what range? O'Hare ignored him, kept his attention on Hutchins. How many aircraft can you load tonight? Hutchins did the math quickly. 6 hours per aircraft if he worked alone. But if he could, get 2 other ordnancemen to help, show them the technique, they could do 3 aircraft simultaneously, 8 aircraft if I get help, maybe 10 if we skip sleep. Get help. Train whoever you need to train. I want half the squadron flying modified loads by dawn. Chief Mitchell won't. Mitchell works for Ramsey. Ramsey works for me in the air. I'll handle the chain of command. You handle the ammunition. O'Hare paused. This modification you made, it saved my life today. I engaged 4 targets I would have avoided with standard ammunition because I knew I couldn't hit them. Now I know I can. That changes everything. He put his hand on Hutchins' shoulder briefly. Whatever happens next, court-martial, reprimands, whatever, this was the right call. You understand that? Yes, sir. Good. Start loading. O'Hare turned and headed toward the island superstructure for debriefing, leaving Hutchins standing on the flight deck processing what just happened. It worked. The physics worked. The ammunition worked. O'Hare killed 4 Japanese aircraft at ranges where kills weren't supposed to be possible. 9 pilots dead over 6 weeks because standard ammunition failed. Now there was proof it didn't have to be that way. Hutchins went back to the armory and started pulling ammunition from inventory. He had maybe 16 hours before dawn, 8 aircraft to load, 14,000. 400 rounds to hand select by weight and hand load into belts. Impossible to do alone. He needed help, which meant violating security protocols by showing other ordnancemen an unauthorized modification. But O'Hare was right. Bureaucracy took time, and pilots died while waiting for approval. At 1,400 hours, Aviation Ordnanceman 3rd Class Robert Palmer and Aviation Ordnanceman 3rd Class James Morrison reported to the armory. Chief Mitchell had sent them. Hutchins, Palmer said, Chief says you're doing some kind of special ammunition loading for Lieutenant O'Hare, and we're supposed to help. What's the deal? Hutchins looked at them, both young, competent, trustworthy. He made a decision. What I'm about to show you is unauthorized. It violates Naval Ordnance regulations. If we get caught, we all face court-martial. You need to know that before I explain anything. Palmer and Morrison glanced at each other. Morrison spoke. Does it work? Lieutenant O'Hare got 4 kills today at over 1,000 yards using ammunition I modified. Then show us, Morrison said. Hutchins pulled out the precision scale and started teaching them how to save pilots' lives by breaking every rule in the manual. By June 10, 1942, 33 days after O'Hare's first test of the modified ammunition, the Bureau of Ordnance in Washington issued Emergency Field Authorization 42-07, officially designating Hutchins's modification as Mix H and authorizing its immediate fleet-wide implementation. The designation came after Admiral Chester Nimitz sent a message to the Bureau that read, Modified ammunition produces 3.2 to 1 kill ratio versus 0.4 to 1 with standard loads. Authorize modification or explain to families why their sons died using inferior equipment. The Bureau capitulated. Mix H became standard doctrine, but the authorization came 33 days late. In those 33 days, Hutchins and his trained ordnancemen had already loaded 127 Wildcats across 4 carriers with matched weight ammunition. Those aircraft flew 218 combat missions and achieved 87 confirmed kills with 7 losses, a 1-2 to 1 kill ratio that naval intelligence initially rejected as statistical impossibility until gun camera footage confirmed every claim. The modified ammunition worked exactly as physics predicted. Where tracers went, API rounds followed. Pilots aimed with confidence, knowing their visible rounds indicated precisely where their killing rounds impacted. Japanese pilots reported American fighters more accurate at long range and adapted tactics accordingly, abandoning long-range attacks that had been effective for 6 months. The tactical shift forced Zeros into closer engagements, where the Wildcats' superior firepower and armor became decisive advantages. The statistical transformation was undeniable. April 1942 with Standard Mix A. VF-3 lost 23 aircraft, achieved 15 kills, ratio 0.65 to 1. May-June 1942 with Mix H spreading fleet-wide. Pacific Fleet fighters lost 31 aircraft, achieved 96 kills, ratio 3.1 to 1. Same pilots, same aircraft, different ammunition. The difference saved an estimated 44 pilots in 2 months. Extended through 1943 to 1945, conservative estimates credited Mix H with saving 800 to 1,000 American lives. Raymond Hutchins received no medal, no promotion, no official recognition. He remained Aviation Ordnanceman Second Class through war's end. Loading ammunition and training others in the modification technique he'd developed alone in an armory at 0230 hours. The Navy couldn't publicly reward someone who'd violated regulations, even when those violations saved lives.